The humid air of the Central Highlands feels like a physical weight, thick with the scent of rotting vegetation and the metallic tang of spent brass. Most people think they know the Vietnam War from Hollywood movies or high school textbooks, but the reality was a complex web of secrets, shadows, and unintended consequences that redefined the soul of a generation. To understand the true nature of this conflict, we must look past the grainy newsreel footage and into the classified files and whispered testimonies that were buried for decades. This was not just a war of bullets and territory. It was a war of ideologies fought in a landscape where the lines between friend and foe blurred until they disappeared entirely. Long before the first American combat troops waded ashore at Da Nang, the seeds of the conflict were being sown in the aftermath of the Second World War. While the world celebrated the defeat of fascism, a small, determined movement in Southeast Asia was preparing for a different kind of struggle. The French had maintained colonial rule over Indochina for nearly a century, but the rise of nationalism, led by a thin, charismatic figure known as Ho Chi Minh, was about to change everything. What many Americans don't realize is that Ho Chi Minh initially looked to the United States as an ally. He was a student of the American Revolution and even quoted the Declaration of Independence in his own speeches. He hoped that the nation born of a struggle against colonial rule would support his own quest for independence. But the geopolitical chessboard of the Cold War was being set, and the fear of communism outweighed the ideals of self-determination. By the early 1950s, the United States was already deeply involved, not with soldiers, but with billions of dollars in aid to the French military. This was a proxy war before the term became a household name. When the French suffered a catastrophic defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, the world watched as a global power was humbled by a peasant army. The resulting Geneva Accords split the country at the 17th parallel, intended as a temporary measure until national elections could be held. But those elections never happened. The United States, fearing a communist landslide, threw its support behind the government of South Vietnam. This decision set the stage for a commitment that would grow from a few hundred military advisors to a force of over 500,000 men. Behind the official briefings and the domino theory was a reality far more chaotic and brutal than the public was led to believe. The war was defined by the concept of attrition, a strategy of wearing down the enemy until they had no will left to fight. But the enemy was not a traditional army. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese regulars were masters of guerrilla warfare, using the dense jungle and an intricate network of underground tunnels to strike and then vanish like ghosts. These tunnels were entire underground cities, featuring hospitals, storage depots, and living quarters, sometimes stretching for hundreds of miles right beneath the feet of American patrols. To counter this, the military turned to devastating technology. Operation Ranch Hand saw the spraying of millions of gallons of herbicides, most notably Agent Orange, to strip away the jungle canopy and destroy enemy crops. The environmental and human cost of this chemical warfare would be felt for generations, leaving a legacy of birth defects and illness that persists to this day. As the decade turned, the conflict escalated into a brutal cycle of search and destroy missions. For the average American soldier, often a teenager drafted from a small town or an inner-city neighborhood, the war was a terrifying blur of heat, leeches, and sudden violent ambushes. They were fighting for hills and valleys that would be abandoned days later, a war where progress was measured not in miles gained, but in body counts. This focus on statistics created a perverse incentive system, leading to inflated reports and, in some tragic cases, the targeting of civilians. The massacre at My Lai remains one of the darkest chapters in military history, a moment where the moral compass of the mission was shattered, leaving a scar on the national consciousness that has never fully healed.
While the fighting raged in the jungle, a different kind of war was being fought in the streets of America. It was the first televised war, bringing the visceral horror of combat into the living rooms of millions every night. The gap between what the government was saying and what the people were seeing began to grow into a chasm known as the credibility gap. The Tet Offensive of 1968 served as the ultimate turning point. Though it was a military defeat for the North, it was a psychological victory that shattered the illusion that the end of the war was in sight. It proved that despite years of bombing and massive troop deployments, the enemy remained capable of launching a coordinated nationwide assault. The untold story of Vietnam is also the story of the secret wars in Laos and Cambodia. While the public was told the fighting was contained within Vietnam, the CIA was conducting a massive clandestine operation in neighboring countries to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This supply line was the bloodline of the insurgency, a hidden network of paths and roads that allowed the North to move men and materiel into the South. The United States dropped more bombs on Laos than it did on Germany and Japan combined during World War II, making it the most heavily bombed country per capita in history. Much of this remained classified for years, hidden from the eyes of Congress and the American people. The logistics of the war were a marvel of engineering and a nightmare of bureaucracy. Huge bases like Conran Bay were built almost overnight, bringing a slice of American life to the edge of a war zone. Soldiers could sometimes find air conditioning and hot meals, only to be dropped back into the primal forest hours later. This jarring contrast between modern comfort and primal survival created a unique psychological strain. Meanwhile, the air war, known as Operation Rolling Thunder, sought to bring the North to its knees through sheer force. But the resilience of the Vietnamese people was underestimated. They moved their factories into caves and repaired bridges faster than they could be destroyed. Internal politics in the South were equally volatile. A series of coups and unstable governments made it difficult for the United States to find a reliable partner. The corruption within the South Vietnamese military meant that much of the American aid never reached the front lines. On the other side, the North was receiving significant support from the Soviet Union and China, turning the region into a boiling pot of global tensions. Every bullet fired in the jungle had echoes in Moscow, Beijing, and Washington. As the late 60s transitioned into the early 70s, the morale of the American forces began to fray. Racial tensions, drug use, and a sense of purposelessness began to affect the troops. The draft had become deeply unpopular, and the wealthy often found ways to avoid service, leaving the burden to fall disproportionately on the working class. This domestic turmoil was mirrored in the combat zone, where some soldiers began to question why they were risking their lives for a government that didn't seem to have a clear plan for victory. The intelligence failures were perhaps the most significant untold aspect. The CIA and military intelligence often had conflicting reports about the enemy's strength and intentions. Key information about the Tet Offensive was ignored or downplayed because it didn't fit the optimistic narrative being pushed to the public. This failure to acknowledge the reality on the ground led to strategic blunders that cost thousands of lives. The role of women in the war is another frequently overlooked chapter, from nurses who worked in horrific conditions near the front lines to the female Viet Cong fighters who were often more determined and lethal than their male counterparts. Women played a vital role on both sides. Their stories provide a different perspective on the endurance and sacrifice required by this total war. As we look at the final years of the conflict, the policy of Vietnamization aimed to shift the burden of fighting to the South Vietnamese forces. But after years of dependency on American air support and logistics, the transition was shaky at best. The signing of the Paris Peace Accords in 1973 was supposed to bring peace with honor, but it was merely the prelude to the final collapse. When the North launched its final offensive in 1975, the South's resistance crumbled with startling speed.
The scenes of chaos at the gates of the American embassy in Saigon were just the visible tip of a much deeper tragedy. While the world watched helicopters ferry the lucky few to safety, hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese soldiers and civilians were left to face an uncertain and often brutal future. The end of the shooting did not mean the end of the suffering. In the months that followed, the new regime established re-education camps where former officers and civil servants were subjected to years of hard labor and political indoctrination. This mass incarceration remains one of the most painful secrets of the post-war era, a silent struggle for survival that took place far from the cameras. The psychological toll on the returning American veterans was another war in itself. Unlike the heroes of World War II, these men returned to a country that was deeply divided and, in many cases, openly hostile to their service. They carried with them the invisible wounds of post-traumatic stress disorder at a time when the medical community barely understood the condition. The transition from the kill-or-be-killed environment of the jungle to the quiet suburbs of America was jarring and often destructive. Many veterans felt they had been abandoned twice, once by their military leaders on the battlefield and once by their fellow citizens at home. Beyond the human cost, the financial drain of the war had permanent effects on the American economy. The staggering cost of the conflict, estimated at over $168 billion at the time, contributed to the runaway inflation of the 1970s. The Great Society programs, intended to lift millions out of poverty, were stripped of funding to fuel the war machine. This trade-off between domestic progress and foreign intervention created a lasting skepticism about the government's ability to manage both the nation's welfare and its wars. In the shadows of the conventional war, the Phoenix program was one of the most controversial intelligence operations ever conducted. Managed by the CIA, its goal was to identify and neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure through infiltration, capture, and assassination. While officials claimed it was a surgical tool to take out high-level operatives, critics and whistleblowers revealed a system rife with torture and summary executions, where local officials often used the program to settle personal scores. This mass incarceration remains one of the most painful secrets of the post-war era, a silent struggle for survival that took place far from the cameras. The air war over North Vietnam also held secrets that are only now being fully understood. Operation Linebacker II, often referred to as the Christmas bombings, saw the largest strikes by B-52 bombers in history. The intensity of the bombardment was designed to force the North back to the negotiating table, but the sheer scale of the destruction raised global outcries over the targeting of civilian infrastructure. Deep inside the Pentagon, analysts were beginning to realize that no amount of conventional bombing could break the will of a population that viewed the struggle as a fight for national survival rather than a mere political dispute. The role of the Hung people in the secret war in Laos is another vital chapter. Recruited by the CIA to fight a clandestine war against the communist Pathet Lao, these mountain tribesmen became the frontline defense against the expansion of the conflict. They rescued downed American pilots and disrupted supply lines at great personal cost. When the United States finally withdrew, the Hung were largely left to fend for themselves, leading to a desperate exodus and a struggle for refugee status that lasted for decades. Their loyalty was met with a betrayal that remains a stain on the history of American foreign policy. Technological advancements during the war also paved the way for modern warfare. The first widespread use of electronic sensors to detect enemy movement along the Ho Chi Minh Trail was a precursor to today's drone and surveillance technology. The development of the Huey helicopter transformed infantry tactics, allowing for rapid deployment and medical evacuation that saved countless lives. Yet every technological leap was met with a low-tech countermeasure.
The North Vietnamese used simple bamboo stakes, primitive booby traps, and sheer human endurance to nullify the advantages of a superpower. The naval history of the war is often overshadowed by the ground fighting, but the Brown Water Navy, the sailors who patrolled the narrow, murky rivers of the Mekong Delta, faced some of the most intense close-quarters combat of the war. Living on small boats and subject to constant sniper fire and waterborne mines, these units were essential in stopping the flow of weapons into the heart of South Vietnam. Their stories of courage in the labyrinth of the Delta's waterways highlight a different kind of naval warfare, one fought in the mud and the silt rather than on the open seas. As the years have passed, the opening of archives in both Washington and Hanoi have revealed a more nuanced picture of the leadership on both sides. We now know that the North Vietnamese leadership was often as divided as the American cabinet, with fierce debates over the timing of offensives and the level of influence to allow from their Soviet and Chinese patrons. Similarly, the Pentagon Papers exposed a long history of government deception, showing that multiple administrations had expanded the war despite knowing it was likely unwinnable. This revelation fundamentally changed the relationship between the American press and the government, ushering in an era of investigative journalism and a more questioning public. The legacy of the war is perhaps most visible at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. The simple black granite wall, inscribed with over 58,000 names, serves as a powerful reminder of the individual lives lost in a conflict of grand strategies and global politics. It has become a place of pilgrimage, not just for veterans, but for a nation still trying to make sense of its most complicated war. The lessons of Vietnam continue to influence military doctrine and foreign policy today, serving as a cautionary tale about the limits of power and the importance of clear objectives.
To look at the war through a modern lens, we must also address the incredible resilience of the Vietnamese people who lived in the north under the constant threat of aerial bombardment. Entire schools and factories were moved into deep underground caverns. Life continued in the dark, lit by kerosene lamps, as teachers taught children the alphabet while bombs fell above. This civilian endurance was a factor that the top brass in Washington failed to calculate. They saw it as a military problem to be solved with tonnage, while the people on the ground saw it as an existential struggle that they were willing to endure for decades if necessary. The story of the prisoner of war camps in the North, most famously the Hanoi Hilton, reveals a different kind of battlefield. American pilots, many of whom were highly trained officers, found themselves stripped of their rank and dignity, subjected to years of solitary confinement and torture. The clandestine communication systems they developed, using tap codes on cell walls, became a testament to the human spirit's ability to resist even in the most soul-crushing conditions. These men became symbols of the war's sacrifice, and their eventual return in 1973 provided a rare moment of national unity for a fractured America. Meanwhile, in the specialized world of the MACV-SOG, the Studies and Observations Group, the war reached its peak of secrecy. These elite teams, composed of Green Berets, Navy SEALs, and indigenous fighters, carried out deniable missions across the borders into Laos and Cambodia. They wore sterile uniforms with no identifying marks and carried non-American weapons to maintain plausible deniability. Their survival rate was among the lowest of the war, as they were often outnumbered hundreds to one in enemy territory. The details of their operations remained classified for nearly 30 years, hiding the true extent of the ground war beyond Vietnam's borders. The medical advancements born from the necessity of the battlefield were revolutionary. Because of the heavy use of helicopters for medevac, a wounded soldier could often be on an operating table within less than an hour of being hit.
This golden hour concept changed emergency medicine forever, leading to the development of civilian trauma centers across the United States. Nurses and medics in Vietnam performed procedures that were previously reserved for senior surgeons, pushing the boundaries of what was possible under fire. Yet, for many, the physical healing was only the beginning of a lifelong journey through the scars of what they had seen. We must also consider the impact of the war on American culture and the media. Vietnam was the first time that journalists had almost unrestricted access to the front lines. Reporters like Michael Herr and photographers like Larry Burroughs didn't just report the news, they captured the visceral, terrifying reality of the grunt's life. This raw imagery stripped away the romanticism of war that had persisted since the 1940s. It created a more cynical, more informed public, and it forever changed how the military handles the press in subsequent conflicts. The ecological devastation caused by the war is a chapter that is still being written. The massive craters left by B-52 strikes turned parts of the countryside into moonscapes, which later filled with water and became breeding grounds for disease-carrying mosquitoes. The long-term effects of dioxin in the soil from Agent Orange continue to affect the food chain and the health of those living in the sprayed areas. It was a war against the environment itself, an attempt to use nature as a weapon that ultimately backfired, leaving a poisoned landscape for the victors and the vanquished alike. In the final stages of the American involvement, the airwaves were filled with the sound of Vietnamization, but on the ground, the South Vietnamese military was struggling with a crisis of leadership. High-ranking officers were often appointed based on political loyalty rather than tactical skill. Despite having some of the most advanced equipment in the world, the lack of a cohesive national identity and the deep-seated corruption in Saigon made it nearly impossible to build a force that could stand alone. When the end finally came, it wasn't just a military collapse, but a total breakdown of the social and political fabric of the South. The international ripples of the war were felt far beyond Southeast Asia. It strained the NATO alliance, as many European allies viewed the American intervention as a colonial-style mistake. It also forced a pivot in American foreign policy toward détente with the Soviet Union and the opening of relations with China, as Nixon and Kissinger sought to find a way out of the Vietnamese quagmire by manipulating the larger global powers. The war proved that even a superpower has limits, and that military might cannot always compensate for a lack of political legitimacy. As we conclude this exploration of the untold facts, we are left with the voices of those who were there, the letters home, the recorded interviews, and the silent stares of those who returned. They tell a story of a war that was never as simple as the headlines made it seem. It was a tragedy of errors, a showcase of incredible bravery, and a permanent turning point in the American story. The shadows of Vietnam still hang over every decision to send troops abroad, a reminder that in the jungle, nothing is ever truly as it appears, and the costs of war are always higher than anyone predicts at the start.
To understand the mechanics of the war, one must look at the weapons that defined the era, starting with the M16 rifle. Its introduction was a disaster of engineering and bureaucracy. Issued to troops in the mid-60s, the rifle was marketed as a self-cleaning marvel, but in the humid, muddy conditions of the jungle, it frequently jammed. Soldiers were found dead with their rifles disassembled in front of them, desperately trying to clear a malfunction in the middle of a firefight. It took years of field modifications and a change in the gunpowder used in the cartridges to make it a reliable weapon, but the early failures created a lasting distrust among the infantry. On the opposite side, the Soviet-designed AK-47 became a symbol of the insurgency's ruggedness. It could be buried in mud, dragged through rivers, and still fire without hesitation.
This disparity in equipment became a metaphor for the entire conflict, the high-tech, fragile superpower versus the low-tech, resilient revolutionary. The draft boards of the 1960s were the silent engines of the war, deciding the fates of millions of young men behind closed doors in every town across America. The system was riddled with inequities. College deferments meant that the war was largely fought by those who couldn't afford an education or whose jobs weren't deemed essential to the national interest. This created a deep class divide that saw the burden of combat fall on the shoulders of the poor and the working class. When the lottery system was finally introduced in 1969, it did little to ease the tension. Instead, it turned birthdays into death sentences, broadcast live on national television as young men watched to see if their number would be called. This internal pressure cooker led to a surge in draft dodging and a mass exodus of thousands of young Americans to Canada, a movement that remains a controversial chapter of the era's social history. In the mountains, the role of the scout dogs was perhaps one of the most poignant and least discussed aspects of the war. These highly trained German shepherds and Labradors saved thousands of American lives by detecting tripwires, ambushes, and hidden tunnel entrances that no human eye could see. They were the unsung heroes of the bush, forming deep emotional bonds with their handlers. However, the end of their story is a dark one. When the United States withdrew, the majority of these dogs were classified as surplus equipment and left behind. Only a fraction of the thousands of dogs that served were ever brought back to American soil, a betrayal that many veteran dog handlers carry with them to this day. The psychological warfare practiced by both sides reached levels of bizarre sophistication. The United States launched Operation Wandering Soul, playing eerie, distorted recordings over loudspeakers in the jungle at night. These tapes featured voices that sounded like dead North Vietnamese soldiers, intended to prey on the spiritual beliefs of the enemy and convince them that they were doomed to wander as ghosts if they didn't desert. While the effectiveness of these psychological operations was debated, it added a surreal, supernatural layer to a war that was already bordering on the hallucinogenic for many participants. As the conflict dragged on, the use of napalm became the defining image of American air power's destructive potential. This jellied gasoline clung to everything it touched and burned at incredible temperatures. Originally designed in a lab at Harvard during World War II, its use in Vietnam sparked a massive moral outcry. It was no longer just about destroying military targets, it was about the horrific suffering inflicted on anyone caught in its path. The internal memos of the chemical companies producing napalm show a cold, businesslike focus on the spreadability and adhesion of the gel, contrasting sharply with the screams of the victims that were beginning to reach the American public. In the aftermath of the fighting, the process of reconstruction in Vietnam was a grueling, decades-long ordeal. The country was unified under a communist government, but it was a nation in ruins. The economy was shattered, the infrastructure was non-existent, and the land was littered with millions of tons of unexploded ordnance. To this day, farmers in the Vietnamese countryside are still being killed by bombs dropped half a century ago. The normalization of relations between the United States and Vietnam in the mid-90s was a landmark diplomatic achievement, but it could not erase the scars of the American War as it is known there. Today, Vietnam is a bustling, modernizing nation, but the skeletal remains of rusted tanks and the lingering health effects of chemicals serve as permanent monuments to the violence of the past. The legacy of the Vietnam Syndrome also fundamentally altered how the American military would engage in future conflicts. For decades, there was a profound reluctance to commit ground troops to foreign soil without a clear exit strategy and overwhelming public support. This led to the development of the Powell Doctrine, which emphasized using decisive force and having a clear political objective before the first shot was fired. The ghosts of Vietnam were present in the planning of the Gulf War and the interventions in the Balkans, serving as a constant reminder that once the dogs of war are unleashed, they are incredibly difficult to cage. We must also acknowledge the boat people, the wave of nearly 2 million refugees who fled Vietnam by sea in the late 70s and 80s. They risked pirate attacks, starvation, and drowning in overcrowded, flimsy boats to escape the political repression of the new government. Their journey was a final, desperate postscript to the war, leading to a massive resettlement effort that brought hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese families to the United States, Australia, and Europe. These survivors built new lives, becoming a vital part of the fabric of their new home countries, yet their presence is a living reminder of the displacement and trauma that war leaves in its wake. The story of the Vietnam War is a story that has no clean ending. It lives on in the genes of those affected by Agent Orange, in the political polarization of the United States, and in the strategic calculations of every modern military power. It was a moment where the world's most powerful nation was forced to confront the limits of its influence and the complexity of a world that refused to be neatly divided into black and white. As we peel back the layers of these untold facts, we find that the true history of the war is not found in the victory parades that never happened, but in the quiet, enduring resilience of those who survived it.
To truly grasp the magnitude of the strategic failure, we must examine the man who sat at the center of the Pentagon's data-driven approach, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. He was a master of efficiency, a former Ford Motor Company executive who believed that war could be managed like a corporate balance sheet. McNamara introduced the concept of systems analysis to the military, placing immense faith in numbers, kill ratios, and statistical trends. However, this cold, mathematical approach failed to account for the human spirit and the intangible power of nationalism. While the computers in Washington predicted a North Vietnamese collapse based on tonnage dropped and casualties sustained, the reality on the ground was a defiant population that viewed time as their greatest weapon. McNamara's eventual private disillusionment with the war, which he kept secret for years while publicly urging escalation, remains one of the most significant moral crises in the history of American leadership. The home front was not merely a backdrop to the conflict. It was a secondary theater of war where the battle for the American soul took place. The soundtrack of the era became a weapon of resistance. From the haunting lyrics of Bob Dylan to the raw energy of Jimi Hendrix, music provided a common language for a generation that felt betrayed by its elders. For the first time, popular culture became a tool for political mobilization on a global scale. The protest songs of the 60s did more than just fill the airwaves. They provided the emotional scaffolding for a movement that eventually made it politically impossible for the government to continue the fight. This cultural explosion was not just about music. It was a rejection of the rigid social structures of the 50s and a demand for a more transparent, accountable democracy. In the dense foliage of the border regions, the role of the forward air controllers, or FACs, was perhaps the most dangerous job in the sky. These pilots flew small, slow, unarmored Cessna aircraft right above the treetops, looking for signs of enemy movement like smoke, disturbed dirt, or broken branches. They were the eyes of the heavy bombers, responsible for marking targets with white phosphorus rockets while under heavy ground fire. Because they flew so low and so slow, they were constant targets for every sniper in the vicinity. Many FACs operated in a state of constant, high-stakes adrenaline, knowing that a single mistake in coordination could result in friendly fire or the loss of an entire ground platoon. Their bravery was legendary, yet they operated largely in the shadows, their contributions rarely mentioned in the official communiques. The intelligence war featured another bizarre and highly classified effort known as Operation Igloo White. This was an attempt to create a macadamized electronic battlefield.
The United States dropped thousands of acoustic and seismic sensors disguised as tropical plants along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. These sensors relayed data to massive IBM computers in Thailand, which would then predict where enemy trucks would be at a certain time. This data was used to direct blind bombing strikes through the clouds and jungle canopy. It was the birth of automated warfare. While it achieved some tactical successes, the North Vietnamese eventually learned to fool the sensors by driving herds of cattle past them or hanging buckets of urine near the acoustic pickups to mimic the sound and scent of human activity. It was a classic example of how low-tech ingenuity could outmaneuver the most expensive technology in the world. As the American footprint grew, the social fabric of South Vietnam began to unravel. The massive influx of American dollars and personnel created a service economy that revolved around the military bases, leading to widespread inflation and a breakdown of traditional rural life. Thousands of farmers abandoned their ancestral lands to move to the cities, seeking work in the bars, laundries, and construction sites that fueled the war effort. This massive internal displacement created a refugee crisis within South Vietnam itself, as people fled both the Viet Cong tax collectors and the American free fire zones. The loss of this connection to the land weakened the social base of the Saigon government, making it even harder to build a stable, popular nation-state. The role of the Australian and New Zealander forces is another part of the untold story, often missed by American audiences. These Anzac troops brought their own expertise in jungle warfare, honed during the Malayan emergency. They operated with a different tactical philosophy, focusing on small unit patrols and long-term concealment rather than the massive search-and-destroy sweeps favored by the Americans. Their presence was a reminder that the Vietnam War was a multinational effort, involving soldiers from South Korea, Thailand, and the Philippines as well. Each of these nations had its own strategic reasons for involvement, from a desire to stop the spread of communism in Asia to a need to strengthen their security ties with the United States. Deep within the archives, we find the records of the peace feelers, the numerous back-channel attempts to end the war through secret diplomacy in cities like Warsaw, Paris, and Oslo. Throughout the 60s, there were dozens of moments where it seemed a negotiated settlement might be possible. However, these efforts were often sabotaged by a lack of trust, internal political pressure in Washington and Hanoi, and the complicating factor of the upcoming American elections. The tragedy of the war is compounded by the knowledge that the terms finally agreed upon in 1973 were not significantly different from what might have been achieved years earlier, had the political will been existent on both sides to compromise. The evolution of the Hanoi Hilton and other prison camps also saw the rise of the go-home programs and the sophisticated use of propaganda by the North. They frequently filmed American prisoners of war under duress, forcing them to sign statements condemning the war. These images were broadcast to the world to undermine American moral authority. Behind the scenes, the prisoners developed their own secret government with a chain of command that remained unbroken despite years of isolation. Their resistance was a psychological victory that denied the North the total propaganda win they desperately sought. As the conflict entered its final years, the phenomenon of fragging, the deliberate killing of officers by their own men, became a terrifying symptom of the breakdown in military discipline. While these incidents were statistically rare, their existence sent shockwaves through the Pentagon. It was a sign that the bond of trust between those who gave the orders and those who carried them out had reached a breaking point. The war was no longer just a struggle against an external enemy. It had become an internal struggle for the survival of the American military institution itself. The post-war era in the United States was defined by the struggle to integrate the lessons of Vietnam into the national identity. For years, the war was a subject to be avoided in polite conversation, a source of shame and pain that many preferred to forget. It took a decade for the first major films and books to begin processing the trauma in a way the public could digest. This period of silence and then slow reckoning shaped the cultural landscape of the 80s and 90s, influencing everything from cinema to the way we honor our veterans today. The healing process has been long and incomplete, but it has led to a deeper appreciation for the complexities of service and the true cost of political failure.
To truly understand why the Vietnam War remains an open wound in the global psyche, we must look at the silence that followed the final evacuation. When the last American helicopter lifted off from the embassy roof in 1975, it didn't just carry away soldiers and diplomats. It carried away the illusion of a world that could be easily managed by superior firepower. The true untold story of the war's end is found in the quiet reconciliation that took decades to even begin. For years, the veterans of both sides lived with the ghosts of the same jungles, the same rain, and the same terror, separated only by the ideologies that had sent them there. The shifting balance of the Cold War eventually moved on, but the landscape of Southeast Asia remained a museum of a conflict that refused to fade. In the villages of rural Vietnam, the American War is remembered not through grand geopolitical theories, but through the enduring strength of families who rebuilt their lives on land littered with the remnants of fallen aircraft and unexploded shells. The resilience of the human spirit became the ultimate victor, transcending the goals of both Washington and Hanoi. In the United States, the legacy of Vietnam eventually transformed from a source of shame into a profound lesson in empathy and realism. We learned through immense pain that the courage of the soldier is a separate entity from the wisdom of the politician. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial, once a controversial design, became a sacred space where a nation finally learned to say the names of those it had tried to forget. This collective reckoning changed how we view service, teaching us that while a war can be lost, the honor of those who fought in it must never be abandoned again. As the decades have passed, the relationship between the United States and Vietnam has undergone a transformation that few would have predicted in 1968. Former enemies now stand as strategic partners, and the streets of Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City, are filled with the energy of a new generation that looks toward the future rather than the past. Yet the echoes of the war remain in the way we question authority, the way we report on conflict, and the way we weigh the cost of every human life sent into harm's way. The Vietnam War was a tragedy of immense proportions, a showcase of incredible bravery, and a masterclass in the unintended consequences of power. It proved that in the face of a people's determination for self-determination, even the most advanced technology has its limits. It taught us that the most important map in any war is not the one showing territory or troop movements, but the map of the human heart and the cultural identity of those on the ground. As we look back at the untold facts, the secret bombings, the hidden heroism of the scout dogs, the psychological warfare, and the back-channel diplomacies, we realize that the truth of Vietnam is not a story of victory or defeat, but a story of endurance, a story of what happens when the world's most powerful nation meets its most determined adversary, and the long, difficult road to peace that follows the final shot.